Okay, well today we're joined by Dr. Clayborne Carson, Director of the King Research and Education Institute at Stanford University. Thanks so much for making the time to be with us today.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. As we approach the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr., you've got some events planned, both at Stanford and there's some in the city of East Palo Alto. We're going to talk about those later in the broadcast. But first, I think we want to concentrate on Martin Luther King's legacy and how that really applies today. Now, you've devoted most of your professional life to the study of Martin Luther King. You probably know him better than anybody on the planet because you've published, you've edited his speeches and his letters. So maybe we can just start with a statement that you made that was that you've come to understand the wisdom of Dr. Martin Luther King and his speeches more as you've grown older. That you heard them before, but now there's some additional importance that you've gleaned from it. Can we start there?
I think initially, like most people, I think, saw him as a civil rights leader.
Yeah.
I was at the March on Washington, so I saw him up on a pedestal and the platform there, speaking to 200,000 people. And at that time, he was in that role of trying to inspire this event to get civil rights legislation passed. So I think that's part of his legacy, but I think as I've become more aware of his mission as a minister, it was really much broader than simply civil rights.
Okay.
And one of the things that's been really interesting in the last few years is just Mrs. King gave me access to the love letters that he wrote to her.
Oh, wow.
Back in the 1950s, 1952, I guess. And in this, he really expresses the gospel that he wants to preach. And he says it's about a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color. Mm-hmm. This is 1952, and I think that one sentence describes pretty well where he was 16 years later. He was dealing with the war in Vietnam. He was dealing with the Poor People's Campaign. He was trying to look at this, what he called the world house, this metaphorical house where all of us live, different identities, racial, ethnic, religious, but we all have to learn to live together as a community. And I think that's the essence of Martin Luther King. The rest of it is kind of accidental. If he hadn't been in Montgomery in 1955 in the same place as Rosa Parks, I'm not sure he would have become a civil rights leader. He would have still been an activist minister, what he called a social gospel minister, but I don't know if he would have been as centrally involved in the movement for civil rights reform. I think he would have been one of these ministers. I think we all know someone like this, the clergy who are concerned about social issues, maybe concerned about the poor and the homeless. That's the kind of minister I think he would have become.
He was there at a flashpoint in very important in our history, but the broader message that he had was one of human rights, social justice.
Exactly, and on a global level.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think Linda had a question related to that.
I read an article where you had said that we're at a crisis point between citizenship rights and human rights, and I was hoping you could explain what you meant by that.
Yeah, I think that the great movements of the mid-20th century had to do with gaining citizenship rights, because if you think about as late as World War II, most people in the world were not citizens of the place where they happened to be. They were colonized people. They were living under apartheid in South Africa. They were living as second-class citizens in the United States. So you had these systematic forms of oppression that limited the ability of people to have any kind of citizenship rights. Those movements, I think, were great movements, largely successful. Now it's in most parts of the world, you can't be denied your citizenship right because of prejudice or bigotry and those sorts of things. And that took up most of the 20th century to accomplish. But outside of citizenship rights are human rights. You know, what rights go with you wherever you are in the world? What rights apply to people who are not citizens? What rights apply to refugees, you know, who are forced out of the place where they are citizens? You know, those are the issues of the 21st century. And also we recognize that a lot of times governments that are supposed to protect citizenship rights deny you human rights. So we still are faced with these. It doesn't, the fact that we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 does not prevent a policeman from killing an unarmed black man or black person in this country. It doesn't prevent someone from taking a gun into a school. You know, all of these sorts of things are the 21st century issues that I think King would see in the realm of human rights, that you have to you have to solve them at a global level in some way. Certainly poverty is one of those. It's not likely that we're really going to solve the problem of poverty in one country. Because if we do, people will want to come to that country. So we have to think in global terms.
That brings me to another point, is that we talk about now, we do have this big sort of flashpoint regarding the concept of immigration and citizenship and who has any rights at all. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit about what's going on in our own country right now.
Yeah, I think King would be a little bit disappointed in the focus on a path to citizenship for DACA kids, because the issue should not be one or the other. As even someone who's here illegally is still a human being. You know, our own Declaration of Independence doesn't say American citizens are endowed with inalienable rights. It was meant as a human rights document. At that time, there was no U.S. citizenship, you know, because we hadn't really become a country yet. So I think that those kinds of issues are where we are today, and we're finding out that there's human rights as an ideal is always in advance of citizenship rights. The way I look at it, you assert a human right to be treated as with dignity as a human being and to have opportunity. It's up to the political world to translate that into legislation, and the government takes on that role of protecting those rights. But you know, when we talk about something, for example, gay rights, you know, is one of those, someone asserts it, it might take 20, 30 years before that becomes a part of the legal structure. So human rights are always evolving in advance of citizenship rights.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, a key to the success of the civil rights movement, and I know you were involved in this, was organizing and organizing at the grassroots level. Are we seeing the same kind of skill or activism around organizing today, do you think, in the various movements that have popped up? I know there's a protest, but protest is only one strategy, right?
Oh, I'm very impressed with the way in which, you know, 3 women can launch Black Lives Matter and use social media in a way that would have been inconceivable in the 1960s to expand a movement from 3 people to 1 million people. I see the same thing in terms of the young students who, you know, kind of spearheaded by the Parkland students, a few months later can stage a march in Washington with 1 million people. You know, that to me is, they understand the power of modern media and how to use it. Now, a lot of times they don't use it for good purposes, but that's true of any time. But I'm sure that anyone who was an organizer, grassroots organizer during the 1960s has to admire that ability. You know, just imagine the kind of work that was required for the March on Washington in 1963, face-to-face, and all of this kind of really hands-on grassroots organizing. And they were able to bring 5 times as many people to Washington in a couple of months. And these are kids, teenagers. Now, a lot of resources have to go into that. And as we were finding out with Facebook and other things, that power can be manipulated and misused, but it's nonetheless powerful. I can reach thousands of people just by doing a tweet. That's
Millions, really.
well, I can't reach millions. Maybe you can, but
I don't have that many followers.
But it is something that we're still tapping, and I'm excited by that. I'm not I don't resent technology. I think it should be used, and it can be used for good or bad, but we should be using it.
Yeah.
There's something about persistence as well. That's one of the things that's come up in terms of one of the teachings of King, if you look at how persistent he was. And I wondered if you could speak to that today as well. It seems as though I recently read an article in which somebody was claiming that today we're not going to have the same effect that King had in terms of movement. And I don't know why they felt that way, but I wondered if you could speak to that, or they're just like a different set of circumstances?
I think it's important to point out that change takes a long time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I think of W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the great black intellectual of the 20th century, and he was one of the founders of the NAACP in 1909. And he was born after the Civil War. And he was dedicated to human rights and civil rights all of his life. But he was born too late to have enjoyed the victory over slavery. He was born a few years after emancipation in the United States. And he died on the eve of the March on Washington. So he lived to 95, but never experienced that great victory over the kind of oppression that he was fighting. And so I think of myself as, I'm very fortunate. I can go into a classroom and talk about colonialism that used to be around, the Jim Crow system that used to be there, apartheid that used to be there. I've seen those victories in my lifetime. But I think young people have to understand that in terms of the great human rights movements of the 21st century, they might be the Du Bois. They might be struggling all their lives to achieve something that they will never see that victory, because these things take time. 100 years in the scheme of history is a short period of time. So when will we see poverty eliminated as a social problem in the world? When will we see that people can move around the world with the same freedom as corporations? I don't know. Certainly, probably not in my lifetime, but maybe in their lifetimes, or maybe in their children's lifetimes. These things take a long time because they require well, first of all, they require the vision. You have to imagine a world very different from the one we have. And then you have to have the persistence. You have to be the long-distance runner. You have to be the person who gets joy out of the small victories and understands that those major victories, when will everyone have access to health care in the world? All of these things are going to take a long time, a long amount of struggle.
I think that's a very significant point in this day and age, because I think that especially with technology, we're accustomed to things happening very quickly, and instant gratification is very much part of the devices that we use every day. So I think that's a piece of wisdom right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we always do have a sense of immediacy that we want to get from point A to point B, but there's also, King really taught us about determination, and as East Palo Alto Councilman Larry Moody said, being at the table, staying at the table, and Dr. King certainly stayed at the table with all different kinds of points of view, and a lot of pressures on him as well. But that's
I mean, you have to appreciate the large vision, but you also have to appreciate the small victories. And he had those mountaintop moments, ending segregation on a Montgomery bus was a major victory. Desegregating a lunch counter was a major victory. But it was a step that was to a larger victory. And I think his skill, when I went back and studied that speech I heard in 1963, he wasn't talking about the immediate goal, and that was getting President Kennedy's civil rights legislation through Congress. You go and look at that speech, he doesn't even mention that. Instead, he says, what we're trying to do is achieve the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. That justified the nation. That's what we're here for. Now, I don't think I even understood that at that time. I mean, how audacious that was. But it helps explain why, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, which was the last major part of the citizenship revolution in the United States, he didn't stop. He didn't retire. Instead, next year he was in Chicago trying to deal with the problems that the North had with the South, along with the South. These problems that are still with us, the problem of urban segregation, school segregation. That was not ended by any piece of legislation. And he was dealing with poverty. He was dealing with war. And we still have those kinds of problems. And I think if he were around, he would be reminding us that's what it really is about. The visionaries are rarely satisfied with they appreciate the smaller victories, because I know that if you never experience the small victories, it is discouraging. But if you can get, say, gun control legislation that will stop school shootings, if you can get assault military weapons banned, that's going to be a step toward a larger victory.
Yeah. One of the things that was quite a dividing issue back in the 60s was the approach, whether you use violence or nonviolence. And I feel like we're still at risk today of going one way versus the other. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit to kind of King's legacy when it comes to nonviolence.
I remember a statement of President Kennedy. He said, "Those who make nonviolent revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." I don't think it's ever, when someone is fighting for something that is basically good and that has to do with human rights and justice, I don't think anyone says that the first choice is to use violence to achieve that. Maybe there's a few people like that, but you don't see a movement based around that. It's always a small handful of people who are willing to use violence to achieve the goal. But if that is frustrated continually, I mean, what does our own Declaration of Independence say? It is a list of, we've been trying to do this. We've been trying to do this nonviolently. We've been trying to achieve these changes, and the power in England is stopping us from doing that. So only at that point do we turn to violence. And I think that that's typically the way I would look at it, is that you know, the task always is to try to work in a cooperative way to bring about change. I mean, that's what democracy is supposed to be about. Democracy is supposed to be the alternative to violence. And if it's working right, it is the alternative to violence. But if it's not working right, you know, sometimes people are left with little choice.
Mm-hmm. And collaboration is the key to that, as opposed to oppositional, you know, confrontation with one another.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, when I look back at the 1960s, yeah, there were a few people, but they were a handful who turned to violence in terms of the, I mean, even a group like the Black Panther Party, you know, they carried weapons, but they said, you know, this is the Black Panther Party for self-defense. They were not saying we're the Black Panther Party for armed revolution.
It's interesting too when you mentioned the Black Panther Party. I mean, they part of what they were doing was setting up businesses, helping people get food. They were working on a human rights level to some extent. Yeah, I mean,
and I think in the end they turned away from the emphasis on picking up the gun,
right,
and emphasized, as you said, feeding people, trying to provide health care, you know, trying to do positive things. And I think that's the natural tendency of movements. And it's always just the few who are going to see violence as the acceptable alternative.
I want to make sure that we have time to cover the events that are planned.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a couple at Stanford and also in East Palo Alto. Can you let us know what is up for next?
I've been working together with Larry Moody for almost a year, and Carl Welsh, who's the promoter, who's trying to bring together these events. And we've decided, first of all, that on April 3rd, well, I should start on April 2nd, because next Monday, Clarence Jones, who has been working with me at the King Institute, there'll be an event featuring him at Cooley Landing in East Palo Alto on around noon, exact time, I'm sure you can find out, but in East Palo Alto, and that's on the 2nd. And then on the 3rd, at Stanford at CMEX Auditorium, we're going to do an event to commemorate King's final speech, the mountaintop speech, with images, music, words. Hopefully, it's a celebration. I want to emphasize his life, not his death. And then the following...
I'm sorry, that one's in the evening, right?
That's in the evening at Stanford at CMEX. And also it'll be the premiere of a new documentary, I Am MLK Jr., and that'll start at 6, but the music will start at 7:30. And then the following Saturday in East Palo Alto, but this time at University Circle, right near the Four Seasons Hotel. It's right on the border of Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. And that'll be more of an all-day commemoration of Martin Luther King's life.
That's April 7th, correct?
April 7th,
April
yes.
7th, yes.
And that'll be kid-friendly for whole families, and we're hoping to attract people to that area and kind of... And I see it as a time to bring together Palo Alto and East Palo Alto. And we purposely chose that as a site where hopefully these two communities will come together and maybe even get to know each other better.
That's the first step.
Yeah.
In cooperating together. Great.
We did a similar event a few years back to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, and that was at Palo Alto City Hall. Mm-hmm. And I remember Larry Moody brought over a contingent from East Palo Alto, and they marched to the event. And he told me at that time, I said, you know, the next time we do something like this, I want to have it in East Palo Alto and have people from Palo Alto come over and get to know their neighbors.
And here we are.
Yeah.
So next Monday, next Tuesday, and next Saturday.
Yes.
People can check out the information in our edition this week, Palo Alto Weekly. It's all listed there. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciated your time and especially your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that wraps it up for this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. We always ask if you like us, hit the button below or subscribe to us so you can get notified of our weekly webcasts. We're on paloaltoonline.com and also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll see you next week.